Welcome back, my friend. Tonight, we shall solve this mystery together, one clue at a time, as secrets slowly unfold in the warmth of this quiet room. As I settled into the plush armchair by the fire, I could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. The invitation had been as cryptic as it was alluring, a summons to Claridge's, a dinner hosted by a woman of wealth and secrecy. The Last Supper, the name alone chilled me. Though I could not say why, there was no mention of what to expect, only the promise of an evening that would alter the course of many lives. The scent of mystery hung in the air, thick and intoxicating, and I could not help but feel that I was about to step into the very heart of a puzzle too dangerous to ignore. Little did I know the night would be one of revelation, where trust would be tested and secrets buried in the past would rise to claim their due. But it was only when the first glass was raised and the first toast made that I truly understood the game was already in motion, and someone at that table would never leave it alive. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Poirot's modest apartment in London, casting a warm glow across his neat desk, upon which lay a curious envelope. Poirot, ever the meticulous observer, had been reading through his usual assortment of letters, invitations, requests for assistance, and the occasional anonymous note, when this particular envelope caught his attention. It was unusually thick, made of textured cream paper, and sealed with a wax emblem he had never seen before. The crest depicted a curious intertwined pair of roses and a golden key. It was elegant, but with a certain air of secrecy that immediately piqued Poirot's interest. With a swift motion, Poirot opened the envelope and carefully unfolded the letter inside. As he read, a small smile touched his lips, though he remained silent. You are cordially invited to an evening that will be your most intriguing yet. On the evening of October 15th, you will dine at Claridge's hotel, where a select group of individuals awaits the final supper in their lives. Come, Poirot, bring your intellect and your eye for detail. You may be the one to solve the mystery before the final toast is made. We are eager to see you. It was signed simply, the Countess. Poirot tilted his head, scrutinizing the words with that familiar spark of curiosity. The final supper in their lives, he repeated under his breath, the words carrying a heavier meaning than they might have at first glance. There was something undeniably eerie about this invitation, but Poirot had learned long ago not to dismiss the most peculiar of circumstances. After all, mystery was his business. He rose from his chair and moved to his desk, his fingers tracing over the wax seal again. The Countess, a name that seemed both regal and ominous. Poirot couldn't help but wonder why someone with such an illustrious title would invite him to what sounded like an unconventional dinner gathering. I will accept this invitation, Poirot decided, nodding to himself with a decisive air. If there is a puzzle to be solved, it will not escape my grasp. No, not this time. With the invitation tucked safely in his coat pocket, Poirot stepped out into the bustling streets of London. A sense of anticipation lingered in the air, but his mind was focused only on the cryptic message that would soon lead him to Claridge's hotel. Arrival at Claridge's. It was on the evening of October 15th that Poirot arrived at Claridge's, his polished shoes clicking along the marble floor, as he was escorted to a private dining room at the far end of the hall. The grandeur of the hotel was impressive, and the opulence of the room was no less extraordinary. The dining table stretched long, bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, and delicate silver dishes sat on an intricately laid tablecloth. Poirot's eyes scanned the room methodically, taking in each detail with the sharpness of a hawk. The room was immaculate, but it wasn't the surroundings that truly intrigued him. It was the people. Seated at the table were 7 individuals, all of whom turned their heads as Poirot entered. They were dressed in evening attire, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, intrigue, and perhaps something more hidden beneath the surface. Poirot's gaze swept over them one by one. There was Charles Underwood, a well-known businessman with a tarnished reputation, sitting at the far end of the table. His expensive suit was immaculately tailored, but the nervous tapping of his fingers on the table betrayed an anxious energy. His eyes darted from guest to guest, never settling in one place for too long. Next to him sat Gwendolen Ashford, a renowned concert pianist whose fame was surpassed only by her temperamental nature. Her hand rested delicately on her wine glass, her expression cold and unwelcoming. She met Poirot's eyes briefly before returning her gaze to the plate before her, seemingly uninterested in any further exchange. At the opposite end of the table was Reginald Barrington, a socialite with an impeccable reputation. So impeccable, in fact, that many had begun to wonder if it were all just a facade. His sharp features were masked by an air of charm, but something about the tightness of his smile seemed forced. Beside Barrington sat Eliza Thornton, a famous writer, whose mystery novels had captivated audiences across Europe. Her sharp, intelligent eyes scanned Poirot carefully, as though weighing his every move, while her lips pressed into a thin line. Her writing was renowned for its brilliant plots, but in the company of these strangers, Poirot wondered if her talents for deception were just as sharp. On the other side of the table, there was Sir Alexander Ffoulkes, a retired judge known for his rigid sense of justice and stern demeanor. His presence in the room was commanding, yet his icy stare suggested that he held no love for the other guests. The faintest hint of distaste curled his lips as he surveyed Poirot, a silent judgment emanating from him. Finally, near the center of the table sat Lady Beatrice Langley, the widow of a late duke. She was a woman of undeniable beauty, but it was her cold, calculating eyes that made Poirot pause. She was the kind of person who never revealed all of herself. She was always hiding something, and Poirot had a strong suspicion that tonight her secrets might be exposed. The last person, seated to the left of Lady Beatrice, was Countess Verona, the enigmatic host. She was a woman of great beauty and grace, her raven black hair cascading over her shoulders like a dark river. Her eyes were sharp, and though her smile appeared welcoming, Poirot could sense something far more sinister beneath the surface. As Poirot took his seat at the head of the table, the room fell silent. The air seemed to grow thicker with each passing moment, and Poirot, ever the observant one, could feel the above tension lingering like a fog. These people were not here by accident. The Countess, with a voice as smooth as velvet, raised her glass. "Tonight," she began, "we gather not only for the pleasure of fine dining, but for something far more special. It is my hope that you will enjoy this evening as much as I have enjoyed preparing it. For some, it will be a meal like no other. And for others," she trailed off, her eyes flashing toward Poirot, "it will be their final supper." The words hung in the air, and Poirot felt a shiver run down his spine. Chapter 2. The Gathering. The first course had been served, an exquisite foie gras, perfectly paired with a crisp, chilled glass of white wine. Yet, despite the gourmet delicacies before them, Poirot's mind could not focus on the meal. His senses were entirely tuned to the atmosphere in the room, to the people around him. Every movement, every glance, every slight shift in posture told a story. Poirot's eyes flickered over the guests as they ate, his thoughts running through a mental checklist of the emotions, personalities, and underlying tensions that filled the room. Lady Beatrice Langley, seated at his left, picked up her knife delicately, but her hand trembled slightly as it hovered over the plate. It was subtle, but Poirot noticed. She was not as composed as she tried to appear. Across from him, Gwendolen Ashford, the pianist, seemed to ignore her food entirely. Her eyes were fixed on the glass of wine in front of her, as though she were trying to read some hidden truth in the swirling red liquid. The tension in her fingers was palpable. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the edge of her wine glass, and every now and then she would flick an impatient glance at the Countess, who remained seated at the head of the table, a smile ever present on her lips. Poirot's gaze then shifted to Charles Underwood, the businessman. His sharp, calculating eyes flicked over the guests, occasionally meeting Poirot's but quickly darting away when caught. His hands were placed flat on the table, but Poirot noticed how he subtly pulled them back when one of the other guests reached for a serving dish. Was he afraid of something? Perhaps of being accused? Poirot could not be sure yet, but his instincts were telling him that Underwood was hiding something, just as most of the guests were. Meanwhile, Sir Alexander Fawkes, the retired judge, sat in complete silence. His face was a stone mask, as if he had long ago learned how to suppress his emotions. His only movement came when he took a slow sip of water, and even then, his eyes never strayed from the plate in front of him. His mere presence seemed to dominate the room, though, and Poirot could sense that the others were, in some subtle way, intimidated by him. As the conversation sputtered and died, only to be revived again by the polite but perfunctory exchanges between the guests, Poirot focused on Eliza Thornton, the writer. She hadn't spoken much yet, but she was far from silent. Her eyes moved rapidly around the table, as though she were assessing the room, evaluating everyone's role in the strange stage play. She had a way of observing the smallest details, and Poirot knew that she wasn't just watching the people around her, she was watching the game. Her game. Poirot cleared his throat. Then, using his most disarming smile, leaned slightly toward Lady Beatrice Langley. "Madame, forgive me, but I must ask, you are quite familiar with the works of the Countess, I presume? A woman of her status surely must have a background that speaks of great influence. You've been acquainted with her for quite some time, I imagine?" Lady Beatrice's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before she composed herself again. "Of course, Poirot. The Countess is well known in our circles, but who in London does not know her name?" "Ah," Poirot nodded. "But her invitation, the Last Supper, as it is so enigmatically called, makes one curious. A dinner so particular. For certain, it carries more than just the weight of fine dining, yes." Lady Beatrice's expression became a little more guarded. "You are quite observant, as always. But you would do well to heed the Countess's words. There is nothing more to this evening than a meal shared among acquaintances. Nothing more at all." Poirot's lips twitched. "Ah, but surely, madame, there is always more than meets the eye. That, my dear Lady Beatrice, is precisely why I have come." Before Lady Beatrice could respond, the air in the room shifted. The conversation died down, and for a moment, Poirot's attention was drawn to the Countess herself. She had been quietly observing them all, her eyes lingering on each of her guests, but now her gaze was fixed firmly on Poirot. Her lips curled into an enigmatic smile, and she spoke in a soft, melodic voice that seemed to carry across the room, even though she hadn't raised it above the murmur of the dinner conversation. "You must forgive the others, Monsieur Poirot," the Countess said. "They are not accustomed to such attentiveness, to be scrutinized so closely. But I know you are not here for idle chit-chat." Poirot's brow furrowed. "Indeed, I am not," he said, his voice steady. "I am here to understand what brings us all together tonight." The Countess raised her glass, eyes never leaving Poirot. "Ah, but that is the very question, is it not? We all have our reasons for being here, Monsieur Poirot. Perhaps some are seeking answers. Others perhaps are seeking redemption." There was a strange pause in the room after her words, a moment of quiet tension. The guests were all watching Poirot as if waiting for him to respond, but he kept his expression neutral. His mind was already working. There was something more to the Countess than she was letting on. She was not merely a hostess playing the role of gracious entertainer. She was pulling the strings. And he was quite certain that tonight the string would snap. Before Poirot could continue his line of questioning, the first course was cleared, and the second course, a delicate lamb dish with a rich rosemary jus, was placed before each guest. As the servants moved away from the table, the hum of conversation resumed, but Poirot could feel the unease that had settled over the group. Gwendolen Ashford, still silent, turned her gaze from the wineglass to the table, then back to Poirot. She leaned forward, her voice low but sharp. "You'll find, Poirot, that this evening is full of surprises, but not all of them will be pleasant." Poirot studied her, his lips curling slightly. "I do not mind unpleasantness, Madame Ashford. It is mystery that intrigues me." A tense silence followed, and Poirot could sense the rising tide of unease among the guests. It was no longer just a dinner, it was a game. And Poirot, ever the strategist, was already moving his pieces on the board. The dinner was merely the prelude to something far darker, something far more dangerous. As the second course was consumed, the dinner carried on. But Poirot's attention never wavered. The pieces were falling into place, slowly but with precision. And one thing was certain. Before the night was over, one of them would fall. The true game had begun. Chapter 3. A Toast. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the walls of the grand dining room, creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere. The guests at the table had finished their second course, a beautifully prepared lamb dish that had seemed to do little to settle the rising unease among them. Poirot, as ever, was keenly aware of every subtle change in the room, the shift in posture, the brief pauses in speech. The way some guests avoided making eye contact. He could feel the tension thickening, like an invisible fog wrapping itself around the table. The Countess, ever the composed hostess, now stood. She raised her glass high, a quiet smile curling on her lips. Her gaze swept across the room, lingering for a moment on each of her guests before settling on Poirot. It was a silent challenge. The air seemed to vibrate with unspoken words. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice soft but carrying through the silence. "You are a man of great intelligence. You have already deduced much, I suspect." She paused, as though letting the weight of her words sink in. "But perhaps you have yet to understand the true purpose of this evening." Poirot gave a small bow of his head, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. He hadn't been entirely sure what the Countess had meant by her cryptic invitation, but her words now made it clear that she was playing a game that was as dangerous as it was intriguing. The guests watched, each of them seemingly uncertain whether to speak or remain silent. Lady Beatrice's lips were pressed into a thin line, her fingers fidgeting with her napkin. Sir Alexander Ffoulkes remained still, as if carved from stone, but his eyes gleamed with something darker. Perhaps the anticipation of a long-awaited confrontation. Eliza Thornton, who had been quietly observing the room until now, leaned forward ever so slightly, her eyes sharp, her mouth tight. The Countess' gaze now moved over the guests again, as though reading their expressions, before she continued. "Tonight is more than a dinner, my friends. Tonight is a reckoning," she said, her voice carrying a note of finality. "A reckoning with our pasts, our secrets, and our choices. As the last course is served, you will understand what I mean. Some of you will embrace it, while others—" She trailed off, the unspoken words hanging in the air. Poirot remained composed, his mind whirling with questions. A reckoning? What did she mean? His eyes flicked to the faces of the others, each of them reacting in different ways, some uneasy, others more defiant. It was Charles Underwood who spoke next, his voice a little too loud, almost as if to break the growing tension. "A reckoning, Countess. Do you mean to suggest that we're all here to atone for something?" His voice had an edge, a slight tremor that betrayed his nerves. "I came for dinner, not some moral lesson." The Countess gave him a measured smile. "Ah, Monsieur Underwood, if only it were that simple." Her eyes met Poirot's again, and the glint in them was something sharp and knowing. "But nothing in life is simple, is it, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot's lips curled into a small smile. "Indeed, madame, life is never quite as simple as one would wish." His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed the sharpness of his thoughts. He could sense a game within a game here. The Countess was not merely inviting them to dinner. She was orchestrating something far more complex. As the Countess held her glass aloft, she gestured for the others to join her in the toast. "To the choices we've made, and to the consequences they bring," she said, her voice smooth and silky, yet carrying a weight that could not be ignored. "May we find clarity this evening, if nothing else." Each guest took a sip from their glass, their faces etched with varying degrees of discomfort. Poirot, ever cautious, lifted his own glass but did not drink just yet. His mind was working overtime, calculating, analyzing. There was something more beneath the surface of her words, a message hidden in plain sight. The glasses clinked together, the sound echoing in the otherwise quiet room. The Countess's smile widened just slightly as she watched her guest drink, and for a moment, Poirot could almost feel the weight of the night pressing down upon them all. The mood shifted after the toast, as though the room had collectively taken a breath, waiting for something to happen. But for a while there was only the sound of silverware against porcelain as the final course, the most anticipated dish of the evening, was brought to the table. The guests seemed quieter now, more introspective, each absorbed in their thoughts, but Poirot could sense the undercurrent of unease that had begun to ripple through the room. He looked at the Countess, who was now seated again at the head of the table, her fingers delicately holding the edge of her glass. There was something about the way she observed the others, something almost calculating, as if she were savoring a secret that only she knew. "Ah, the final course," said Poirot, breaking the silence. "What will it be, I wonder?" The Countess tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into a knowing smile. That, Monsieur Poirot, will be the most revealing course of all. At that moment, just as the last plates were being set down before each guest, something unexpected happened. A shadow crossed the doorway, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the hallway. A young waiter burst into the room, his face pale. "Excuse me, madame," he said breathlessly. There's been an incident in the kitchen." A hush fell over the room. The Countess's smile faded, and she looked at the waiter with a sudden, sharp intensity. "What do you mean, incident?" she demanded. The waiter swallowed hard, his hands trembling. "A bottle of wine, madame. One of the bottles of wine. It's gone missing, and there's blood. It's in the kitchen, madame. A pool of it." The words hung in the air, and Poirot's sharp eyes were already observing the subtle reactions of the others. The guests shifted uncomfortably, but none seemed to want to speak. The Countess's gaze flicked toward the waiter, and her face tightened, though she maintained her composure. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice now cold and commanding, "perhaps you would care to investigate." Poirot's eyes gleamed as he rose slowly from his seat. "Of course, madame." A mystery such as this cannot be ignored. He made his way toward the door, but before he could exit, he paused, turning to face the guests with a slow, deliberate smile. "It seems," he said, his voice filled with a quiet satisfaction, "the evening has just begun." And with that, Poirot stepped into the hall, his mind already working on the new puzzle that had been presented to him. There was no doubt in his mind. Tonight, the truth would be revealed. Chapter 4. The first sign, Poirot's footsteps echoed in the grand hallway of Claridge's as he followed the young waiter, whose face had turned an alarming shade of white. The sounds of the dinner party, muffled and distant behind him, seemed to grow faint with every step he took away from the dining room. The waiter led Poirot past polished walls adorned with fine art, their beauty at odds with the growing tension that had settled over the hotel. They arrived at the kitchen's door, and the waiter paused, looking nervously at Poirot. It's just inside, monsieur. I've already alerted the staff, but it doesn't look good." Poirot nodded, his eyes narrowing as he took in the situation. He stood still for a moment, allowing the silence to stretch, his mind moving with methodical precision. What had truly happened? With a quiet gesture, Poirot stepped into the kitchen, the scent of rich cooked foods and warm bread filling the air. It was a spacious room, brightly lit, its stainless steel countertops gleaming under the overhead lights. But it was not the neatness of the kitchen that caught his attention. It was the chaos in the center of the room. A large spill of deep red wine had stained the marble floor in a jagged arc, and there, amidst the discarded bottles and broken glass, lay a figure, motionless, blood pooling beneath him. The body of the sous chef, the one responsible for plating the evening's delicate courses, was crumpled on the floor. His face was pale, his eyes wide open in a look of shock that had been frozen in time. A jagged shard of glass was embedded in his neck, and the wine that had spilled from the broken bottle mingled with the blood, forming an ominous crimson pool. Poirot's expression remained unchanged as he observed the scene, though his mind was already working in overdrive. A murder? Here? The waiter, standing just behind him, shifted uncomfortably. We think it was the wine, monsieur. The bottle, the one we were supposed to serve at the table, it was tampered with. But we don't know how this could have happened. There were no signs of a struggle, nothing unusual until we found him like this. Poirot crouched by the body, his sharp eyes scanning the kitchen for any clue that might have been overlooked. His fingers gently touched the edge of the glass embedded in the sous chef's neck. Noting its position, there was something strange about the angle, something that didn't quite make sense. "Tell me," Poirot began, his voice calm yet piercing. "When did the wine go missing? You say it was supposed to be served to the guests, but it was tampered with. Why, I wonder, would the murderer, if this is indeed murder, choose such a dramatic method?" The waiter swallowed, his eyes darting nervously to the floor. "The wine was brought from the cellar by one of the kitchen staff around the same time dinner started. It's one of the finest bottles in the house. Rare, expensive, we always serve it with the main course." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his gaze never leaving the body. "And who had access to the cellar tonight?" "Everyone in the kitchen," the waiter replied quickly. "But the wine, it was supposed to be opened by the head waiter himself. No one else was supposed to handle it." Poirot stood up slowly, turning to the waiter, his expression unreadable. "Did anyone notice anything unusual when the bottle was opened?" The waiter hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, it seemed odd. There was a strange smell when it was opened, something like almonds but faint, but no one said anything. We assumed it was just the wine's bouquet, nothing more." Poirot's brow furrowed. A faint smell of almonds? Could it be cyanide? "It would seem that someone, monsieur, has planned this very carefully," Poirot muttered to himself. He then looked directly at the waiter. "Where is the head waiter?" The waiter blinked, as though unsure of what to say. "He's still with the guest, Monsieur Poirot." "He has not been informed yet." Poirot's lips tightened. "Then you will go and fetch him." "I need him here immediately." The waiter nodded and hurried off, leaving Poirot alone with the body. The silence of the kitchen was suffocating, broken only by the soft clatter of pots and pans as staff members moved in the background, trying to continue their duties in spite of the crime that had just occurred. Poirot crouched once again beside the body, his eyes scanning the surroundings more intently now. The murder, if that was what it was, had been meticulously planned. The wine was the intended weapon, and yet it had been tampered with in a way that suggested the murderer had expected someone to open the bottle. A curious thought crossed Poirot's mind. Who would want to kill the sous chef? Was he simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, or had he been specifically targeted? Poirot's eyes flicked back to the bottle of wine. It had been shattered during the struggle. Its contents spilled across the floor. But there was something about its positioning that made Poirot pause. The bottle had been placed deliberately near the body, almost as if it were meant to be discovered. Could this have been a message? Poirot's mind raced. Number. The killer was trying to misdirect us. Perhaps they wanted the wine to be the focus of the investigation. But why? His thoughts were interrupted by the return of the head waiter, a tall man with an air of authority. He seemed unfazed by the blood, but his eyes were tense as he took in the scene. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," he said smoothly, his voice controlled, but with an undertone of nervousness. "I see we have a problem." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "We have more than just a problem, monsieur. We have a murder." The head waiter's eyes flickered toward the body, then back to Poirot. "Murder? No, that cannot be. The sous chef must have done this to himself in some sort of tragic accident." Poirot shook his head slowly. "I do not believe so. This was no accident, and you, monsieur, are the next person I intend to question." As the head waiter froze in place, Poirot's sharp eyes caught a slight shift in the man's expression, a flicker of something. Guilt, nervousness, or perhaps a hint of something deeper, something far darker? Poirot stood tall and fixed the waiter with a penetrating stare. "We are only beginning to unravel the truth, but I promise you this. The answers lie within this very kitchen." The game was afoot, and Poirot was already 2 steps ahead. Chapter 5. A Web of Lies. The tension in the kitchen was palpable as Poirot stood, his gaze fixed on the head waiter, who seemed unnerved by the detective's directness. The sous chef's body still lay on the floor, its tragic presence serving as an eerie reminder of the danger lurking within the walls of Claridge's. The head waiter cleared his throat, struggling to maintain his composure under Poirot's scrutiny. "Are you accusing me of something, Monsieur Poirot?" he asked, his voice a little too steady to be entirely convincing. Poirot gave a small, measured smile, his eyes twinkling with the calm certainty of a man who already knew more than he was letting on. "I'm not accusing you of anything, monsieur." "Not yet. But you see, I find myself very curious. You say this is an accident, yet I find it most unusual that the wine bottle, the very bottle that was to be served to the guest, was the means of death." The head waiter opened his mouth to respond, but Poirot was already moving, circling the body, inspecting the surrounding area with meticulous care. "Who had access to the wine tonight?" he asked again, his voice firm. "Everyone in the kitchen, of course." "But the wine, it was supposed to be opened by me. I was preparing it myself when—" The head waiter faltered, glancing down at the body. "But I didn't even see him. The sous chef was already dead when I arrived." Poirot's expression remained impassive, but his mind was racing. Something didn't sit right with the waiter's story. He was either lying or omitting crucial details. Poirot stepped closer to the man, his gaze never leaving his face. "And you are certain no one else could have tampered with the wine?" The head waiter nodded quickly, though his hands fidgeted in his apron. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. I was the one who brought the wine from the cellar. I assure you, no one else had access to it." Poirot's lips pressed together, his eyes narrowing. He could see the man was nervous, but not just from the shock of the murder. There was something more. Poirot knew the head waiter was hiding something. But what? Just as Poirot was about to continue his questioning, a quiet voice interrupted. "Forgive me, Monsieur Poirot," came the voice of Eliza Thornton, the writer, who had quietly entered the kitchen, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. She stepped forward with a calm confidence, her expression unreadable, but Poirot could sense she was as intrigued as he was. "But it seems to me there is more than meets the eye here. The question is not whether the wine was tampered with, but why it was tampered with in the first place." Poirot turned to her, his interest piqued. "Ah, Madame Thornton, you see things clearly. You are correct. This is not merely about the wine, but about the intent behind it." She nodded slightly, her gaze flicking between Poirot and the head waiter. "The wine is merely a tool, a means to an end. The question is, who benefited from the sous chef's death?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. He was impressed by her insight. "Aha, madame. That is the true heart of the matter, is it not? Who gains from this crime?" The head waiter shifted uncomfortably at the question, his gaze darting to the floor. I don't know. I'm just a servant in this place. I don't know about personal motives or gains." "Yet," Poirot pressed, his voice cutting through the air, "you are aware that everyone in this room has a secret to hide? Perhaps it is time to examine not only the facts of the crime, but the motives of those involved. For the murderer is not only the one who strikes the final blow, it is the one who has the most to gain. The air grew heavier with each word Poirot spoke, and even the head waiter seemed to feel the weight of his observations. The silence stretched for several moments until Poirot's voice once again broke through. Come, come, we must not tarry. I have many questions for you, monsieur, and for the rest of the guests, Poirot turned to Eliza Thornton. I believe it is time for us to investigate further. Back in the dining room, as Poirot and Eliza returned to the dining room, the guests had resumed their uneasy chatter, but the atmosphere was markedly different. There was an undercurrent of suspicion now, as if everyone was aware that the night had turned from a simple dinner into a deadly game of secrets and lies. Poirot's eyes scanned the room with surgical precision, observing each guest's reaction to the news of the murder. Every single one of them was a potential suspect, and Poirot was determined to uncover the truth. He took a seat at the head of the table, his eyes slowly moving from one guest to another. The Countess had resumed her position at the far end of the table, her demeanor as poised as ever. But Poirot could see the tension in the way she gripped her wine glass. Gwendolen Ashford, the pianist, sat in almost complete silence, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression cold and detached, though her eyes flicked nervously toward Poirot. Madame Ashford, Poirot said softly, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. You seem to have an interesting disposition. May I ask, were you aware of the sous chef's death before it was announced? Her lips tightened, her gaze never leaving the table. I was not aware, Monsieur Poirot, but I could sense something was amiss the moment the wine was served. Her voice was low, almost imperceptible. It didn't taste right. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And what, may I ask, did you taste in the wine that seemed wrong? A flicker of something, perhaps regret, perhaps fear, passed through Gwendolen's eyes. I am no expert in poisons, but I've tasted enough wines to know when something is off. It was bitter, but I assumed it was just the wine's age or a strange blend. I didn't think anything of it. Poirot nodded, slowly filing this information away for later. Interesting, he muttered to himself. Very interesting indeed. Next, Poirot turned his attention to Sir Alexander Fawkes, whose silence had been a constant throughout the evening. The retired judge had been watching the entire exchange, his eyes calculating, never missing a detail. Poirot could almost feel the weight of his gaze on him. Sir Alexander, Poirot said, I trust you have had the opportunity to examine the situation. What are your thoughts on the crime? The judge's lips twitched into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. A murder in the kitchen, Poirot. It's hardly the setting for a well-thought-out plan. I suspect this is just an unfortunate accident. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Do you truly believe it was an accident, Sir Alexander? Given the circumstances, I would suggest that such a conclusion is too simplistic. The judge's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over the entire table once more. The web of lies was beginning to form, and it was becoming clearer that everyone in this room had something to hide. The puzzle pieces were shifting, and though he had gathered a few fragments of truth, the complete picture was still elusive. As the evening wore on, Poirot knew that it was only a matter of time before the true killer made their next move. But who among them was desperate enough to commit murder? One thing was certain. The dinner had turned into a dangerous game, and Poirot was determined to uncover every hidden secret before it was too late. The web of lies had only just begun to unravel. Chapter 6. The Countess's Past. The tension in the air was thick as Poirot continued his quiet, methodical observations of the dinner guests. With the first murder now known, the secrets of Claridge's had begun to unravel, but Poirot was far from satisfied. He could feel that there was more to this evening than the isolated tragedy in the kitchen. The Countess, however, seemed to be the key to the puzzle, a woman so composed, so deliberate in every movement, but whose past remained a mystery to everyone at the table. And it was this past that Poirot was determined to uncover. A quiet conversation. As the guests resumed their conversation, the murmur of voices grew louder, but Poirot remained silent, his sharp mind working. He had already interrogated the head waiter and Eliza Thornton, both of whom had offered little more than speculation and surface-level insights. It was now time to turn his attention to the Countess. Poirot stood up slowly, excusing himself from the table with a slight nod. He moved toward the back of the room, where the Countess had taken a moment of solitude. She was standing by the grand windows, gazing out at the London skyline, her back turned to the dining room. The soft glow of the moonlight illuminated her figure, casting a silver halo around her. Poirot approached quietly, his footsteps barely audible on the plush carpet. When he reached her side, he paused for a moment, allowing the silence to stretch between them. "You seem distant, madame," Poirot said, his voice smooth but direct. "I would say you are troubled. The evening has not unfolded as you expected, has it?" The Countess turned slowly, her gaze flickering briefly to him before she regained her composure. "Monsieur Poirot, you have an uncanny way of getting straight to the heart of the matter." She smiled, but it was a cold, calculating smile. "You are correct. This evening was meant to be different. But I suppose the truth has a way of coming out, no matter how much we try to bury it." Poirot studied her closely. Her posture was perfect, her face a mask of elegance, but he could see the subtle tremor in her hands as she reached for her glass of wine. She was hiding something that was weighing heavily on her mind. Poirot could feel the gravity of it, as though the weight of her past had finally caught up with her. "Tell me, madame," Poirot said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "What is it that troubles you so? You have been playing a game tonight, but the stakes are higher than you realize." The Countess's expression hardened for just a moment before she gave a quiet laugh, the sound forced and brittle. "You do not waste time with pleasantries, do you, Monsieur Poirot? But then, I suppose you wouldn't be the famous detective that you are if you did." She took a slow sip of wine, her gaze never leaving his. "There are things, Monsieur Poirot, that I have done in my past that I cannot undo. People I have wronged, lives I have destroyed. Perhaps it is fate that has brought us all here tonight. Perhaps it is time for me to face the consequences." Poirot remained silent, his eyes narrowing. There was more here than she was letting on, but he could feel that she was not yet ready to reveal it. Instead, she changed the subject, her voice softening. "Do you believe in fate, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, almost as if testing him. Poirot's lips curved into a small smile, but his eyes remained sharp. "Ah, madame, I believe in many things. But fate is often a poor excuse for the actions of men and women. We make our own choices, and those choices carry consequences." The Countess gave a quiet sigh, as though her resolve was slowly crumbling under the weight of Poirot's scrutiny. "You are right, of course. We are the architects of our own destruction, But some of us are trapped in a web we can never escape. The hidden truth Poirot stepped closer, his voice low. What is it, madame? What have you done that has led us here tonight? For the first time, the Countess faltered, her expression shifting from icy composure to something much more vulnerable. She looked away, her gaze focused on the city lights below, lost in thought. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. It's not something I like to talk about, she said, her eyes distant. But my family, my late husband, they were involved in things they shouldn't have been. My husband had business dealings that crossed dangerous lines. There were debts, old ones. He was a man of many secrets. Poirot's gaze never left her, his mind turning the pieces over. And you? What part did you play in these secrets? The Countess hesitated for a long moment before speaking again. I knew everything. I knew about the debts, the deals, the people he was in league with. And when he died, when he was murdered, her voice cracked slightly and she quickly composed herself. I inherited everything, his wealth, his title, his enemies. I thought I could escape it all, but I was wrong. Poirot studied her closely. Her confession was vague, but it spoke volumes. She was a woman caught in the web of her past, a past that had come back to haunt her in the form of tonight's murder. It was becoming clear that the murder of the sous chef was just the beginning. There were far darker forces at play here, forces that had been brewing for years. What do you think happened tonight, madame? Poirot asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Was the murder a result of your past? Is this someone seeking revenge? The Countess's lips pressed into a thin line, and she shook her head. I don't know, Monsieur Poirot. But I do know one thing. This dinner was meant to be the end of something. Something that has been lingering for far too long. I thought I could bury the past, but now it's come to collect its price. Poirot paused, his sharp eyes studying her face for any hint of deception. It seems to me, madame, that you've underestimated the power of your own actions. But the truth will come out, I assure you of that. Returning to the table. With that, Poirot turned to leave, his mind churning with the new information. The Countess's past was tangled in ways he had not yet fully unraveled, but it was clear that whatever secrets she was hiding were deeply entwined with the events of this evening. As Poirot returned to the dining room, the air felt thicker than before. The guests had grown quieter, their conversations halting whenever he entered the room. They too could sense that something much darker was unfolding. He took his seat, but not before casting a final glance at the Countess. She was watching him intently, her eyes betraying a sense of fear that had not been there before. She knew, just as Poirot did, that the game was far from over. The evening had only just begun to reveal its true nature, and Poirot was determined to uncover every layer of deception before the night was through. The Countess had given him a glimpse into her past, but it was still a far cry from the full truth. And as the dinner continued, Poirot knew one thing for certain. The murderer was among them. And soon, the web of lies would unravel, piece by piece, until the truth was exposed. But who was the true victim in this tangled web? And who would be the next to fall? The answers were waiting to be uncovered, and Poirot was ready to face them head-on. Chapter 7. A second attempt. The dinner had now reached an unsettling climax. Poirot sat at the head of the table, his sharp eyes scanning each guest in turn, analyzing their every move, every flicker of emotion that passed across their faces. The atmosphere in the room was thick with suspicion, every laugh a little too forced, every word a little too careful. The guests, once indulgent in their food and wine, were now retreating inward, eyes darting nervously toward one another. The first murder had sent a ripple through them all, and the lingering presence of Poirot was doing little to ease the tension. The Countess sat at the far end of the table, her face now a perfect mask of calm. She had revealed more than she had intended during her earlier conversation with Poirot, but it was clear that whatever past she carried with her, it was not something she wanted to revisit. Not in front of these people, not under the harsh scrutiny of Poirot's gaze. Yet, despite her best efforts to regain control, she couldn't suppress the occasional flicker of unease in her eyes, a tension that was palpable every time Poirot looked her way. Across from him, Gwendolen Ashford had not touched her wine or food in nearly an hour. The pianist was still, her hands folded on her lap, her gaze fixed on the delicate glass of wine in front of her, as though she were lost in thought. There was something about her demeanor, an almost deliberate detachment from everything around her, that made Poirot uneasy. The silence in the room hung thick. The guests had learned by now that this was no ordinary dinner, no celebration of fine food or good company. A murder had already been committed, and the air was heavy with the knowledge that the night was far from over. Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp clink of silver against porcelain as Sir Alexander Fawkes, the retired judge, pushed his chair back and stood. He was tall and commanding, his face set in its usual stern expression, but there was a hardness in his eyes that suggested his patience was wearing thin. "We cannot sit here forever in this suspense," Sir Alexander said in a voice that carried across the table. "The situation is grave, I admit, but to linger on in this silence is no better than cowering. We must proceed." The Countess turned her head slightly towards Sir Alexander, her lips pressing into a thin line. "And what do you suggest, Sir Alexander? That we continue our meal as if nothing has happened? Pretend that we are simply here for a pleasant evening?" "Not at all," Sir Alexander replied, his voice sharp. "But surely you don't expect us to remain passive while an investigation unfolds? We must take action." Poirot watched the exchange with quiet amusement. Sir Alexander was no fool. He had an air of authority that made everyone around him feel smaller. But in Poirot's eyes, the judge's insistence on action seemed like an attempt to regain control of a situation that had long since slipped beyond his grasp. But you see, Sir Alexander," Poirot said, breaking his silence, "it is not for us to take action. That is the work of the law, no? We are merely observers for now. I do not doubt, however, that the true culprit is already among us." The judge's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, the sound of a chair scraping sharply across the floor interrupted them. It was Eliza Thornton, the writer, who had stood up abruptly, her chair rocking back as if she had been propelled by some unseen force. Her eyes were wide, her face drained of color. "Monsieur Poirot! Look quickly!" she cried, her voice cracking. All eyes turned to her as she pointed toward Gwendolen Ashford, who had suddenly collapsed forward onto the table, her head resting heavily on her arms. The wine glass she had been staring at now tipped over, spilling dark red liquid onto the crisp white linen. At first, Poirot thought she might have fainted, the shock of the evening taking its toll on her nerves. But as he rose to his feet and hurried over, something about the scene seemed wrong. The air in the room had grown suddenly cold, and the silence was broken only by the shallow, uneven breathing of the pianist, who appeared to be unconscious. Poirot knelt beside her, his fingers gently touching her wrist, checking for a pulse. It was there, faint but steady. Her breathing, though shallow, was even, and her skin was unnaturally cool to the touch. The guests had gathered around the table now, and the Countess moved closer, her expression unreadable. Eliza Thornton was at the edge of the group, her hands clasped tightly together, her mouth pressed into a tight line. Sir Alexander Fulks stood back, his expression grim, while Charles Underwood, the businessman, seemed to be waiting for someone else to take charge. Only Lady Beatrice Langley remained seated, her posture rigid and her face drawn with worry, though her eyes were fixed firmly on Gwendolen. "Poisoned," Poirot said softly, his voice carrying an air of certainty. There was a collective gasp as everyone took a step back from the table, their faces marked by confusion and fear. But how?" Lady Beatrice whispered, her eyes wide with alarm. "She was just fine a moment ago." Poirot examined the wine glass carefully, turning it in his hand. The wine had been spilled across the table, but there were traces of something unusual on the rim of the glass, a faint powdery residue that had been dissolved into the liquid. It was subtle, nearly invisible to the untrained eye, but Poirot's sharp gaze never missed a detail. "This," he said, looking up from the glass, "is not simply a case of wine poisoning. This is something more sophisticated." Eliza Thornton took a step closer, her voice tremulous. "What do you mean, Poirot? Is she dead?" Poirot hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet, but if she is not treated, then she will be. The poison is fast-acting. Whoever did this knows their craft." A shiver ran through the room as the realization hit. Another murder attempt had been made, and this time it was not the businessman, Charles Underwood, who had been the intended victim. It was Gwendolen Ashford, the pianist, who had almost fallen victim to the same fate. Poirot stood up, his eyes moving from one guest to another. "This, mes amis, is no accident. The murder attempt on Miss Ashford is part of something far more elaborate, something deeply personal. But who among you is the true culprit?" There was a long pause as each guest exchanged nervous glances. The weight of Poirot's words hung heavy in the room, and for the first time that night, the air seemed to crackle with tension. As the minutes passed, Poirot's mind was already working at full speed. The motive was still unclear, but the game was afoot. Someone in this room had a very particular reason for wanting Gwendolen Ashford dead. But why? What could she have known, or what had she done to make her the target of such violence? Poirot knew that it would take careful investigation to uncover the truth. But one thing was certain. The murderer was getting bolder, and the stakes were higher than ever. As the guests continued to watch Gwendolen Ashford's still form on the table, Poirot stepped back, his eyes scanning the room one last time. He would find the answers and the murderer would not escape. But who would be the next victim? The evening had just begun to reveal its darkest secrets. Chapter 8. Deeper Investigation. The dinner had turned from a calm evening of fine dining into a deadly game of survival. The second attempted murder, this time on Gwendolen Ashford, the renowned pianist, had shocked everyone into a state of heightened awareness. The guests, though visibly shaken, remained silent as Poirot methodically began to piece together the truth. The feeling of suspicion and dread had settled like a dense fog over Claridge's, and the very air seemed charged with the knowledge that anyone in the room could be next. The tension in the room. Poirot stood over the still body of Gwendolen Ashford, who had been carried to a nearby chair after her collapse. Though she had regained consciousness after the poison was administered, she was still groggy and pale, her eyes half-lidded, struggling to focus on anything. The doctor had been called, but it was clear that the danger was not yet over. Poirot had already instructed the waiter to fetch her some water with a dose of activated charcoal, a quick remedy he hoped would neutralize the poison, but he knew that time was running out. "Madame Ashford, how do you feel?" Poirot asked, his voice calm and reassuring. He had seen the effects of poison many times in his career, and his instincts told him that she would not die. Not yet, at least. She had fainted, but there was a chance to save her. Her breathing was still shallow, but there was a faint pulse in her wrist. The pianist blinked and turned her head slowly to face him, her eyes unfocused. I feel strange, she said, her voice weak. It's like my mind's foggy, and I can't breathe properly. Poirot nodded, keeping his voice steady. That is to be expected, madame. You have been poisoned, but you will recover. You must remain calm. Gwendolyn's lips trembled slightly, and for a moment Poirot thought she might lose consciousness again. But she managed to force herself to focus on him. Her voice was faint, but it was enough for Poirot to hear the panic that lurked beneath the surface. Who did this to me, Monsieur Poirot? Was it... Her voice trailed off as she seemed to lose her train of thought, her head lolling slightly to one side. Poirot could sense the deep fear in her, a fear that had nothing to do with the physical effects of the poison, but with something darker, something that she was too afraid to say. It was not just the wine, was it, madame? Poirot asked gently. The wine was poisoned, but the method is much more intricate than you realize. Someone intended to kill you. Gwendolyn's eyes widened, and she reached for his hand, her grip weak. Yes. I don't know who, but I've been followed for days now, ever since we arrived at Claridge's. Someone is watching me. I know it. The wine wasn't the only thing poisoned. Her voice cracked as she spoke, and her grip loosened. Poirot's expression remained steady, though his mind was racing. Gwendolyn's words confirmed his suspicions. There was more to this than a simple dinner turned deadly. The pianist had been targeted for reasons he could not yet understand, and the poison had merely been the weapon of choice. Before he could ask her more questions, the door to the dining room swung open, and the doctor hurried in, his medical bag in hand. The man was a tall, thin figure with a look of quiet urgency in his eyes. He immediately knelt by Gwendolyn's side, checking her pulse and examining her face carefully. What happened? The doctor asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. She's been poisoned, Poirot replied succinctly. But I believe she will survive if she takes the proper treatment. The wine was poisoned, but there was something more, something she sensed even before the collapse. The doctor nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. I will administer an antidote, but we must keep her under close watch. This poison is lethal, if not treated in time. Questions. Begin. As the doctor worked to administer the antidote, Poirot's mind shifted back to the gathering in the dining room. The guests were still seated at the table, their faces pale and filled with anxiety. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was planned. The guests were not merely witnesses. They were part of a far more intricate game. Poirot turned to the others, his eyes scanning their faces, seeking any sign of guilt or anxiety. He could feel their fear. There was a palpable tension in the room, the kind that arises when someone knows they are being watched, when the truth is just within reach but no one dares to speak it aloud. he stepped forward and addressed the group. Mes amis, the situation is grave, and I cannot stand idly by while there is more at stake than meets the eye. One of you among this very group has orchestrated the death of the sous chef, and now another attempt has been made. The question is not why, we know that already, but who Sir Alexander Ffoulkes, the retired judge, was the first to speak, his voice firm and measured. Poirot, this is madness. How can you say that one of us is responsible? What reason could we have for such heinous acts? Poirot turned his eyes towards Sir Alexander, studying him with a piercing intensity. What reason, Sir Alexander? What reason do any of you have? That is the question that will drive me forward, but for now I will tell you this. There is no such thing as coincidence. This is not a random series of events. This is carefully crafted. The Countess' expression had changed, the usual calm now replaced with a tightness around her mouth. She opened her lips to speak, but then closed them again, as though choosing her words with great care. What do you mean by that, Poirot? Are you accusing us all of being complicit in this crime? Poirot paused for a moment, glancing at each guest before speaking. I am not accusing anyone, madame. But the facts are as clear as day. The first victim, murdered by poison. The second attempt, the same method, but this time aimed at the pianist. But why? Why her? Why now? His eyes shifted across the table to Charles Underwood, the businessman, who had been unusually quiet. Underwood's eyes shifted uncomfortably under Poirot's gaze. You, monsieur, Poirot said sharply, have the most to lose, I believe. Your empire, your reputation, your wealth. Surely, you do not expect me to believe this is all coincidence. Underwood straightened in his chair, his face flushed with sudden anger. You're implying that not yet, Poirot interrupted smoothly. But I will get there, monsieur. In due time, I will understand who among you has chosen to play this deadly game. A dangerous game. Poirot's mind was racing now, more pieces falling into place with each passing second. The murdered sous chef, the poisoned wine, the failed attempt on Gwendolen Ashford's life. It was all part of something much larger. Someone in this room was orchestrating a masterful game, and they weren't going to stop until their goal was achieved. Poirot looked back at Gwendolen, who had regained a bit of color in her cheeks as the antidote began to work its way through her system. She would survive, but for how long? Would she be the next target? The game had just grown more dangerous. And the stakes? The stakes were higher than anyone in this room realized, but Poirot was on the case. He always was. The web of secrets was deeper than he had ever imagined, and every step he took would bring him closer to the heart of the truth. The next move was his. Chapter 9. The Final Clue. The night had unfolded in ways that Poirot could never have anticipated. What had started as a quiet dinner had turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse, with each guest a potential suspect, each piece of the puzzle more complex than the last. Gwendolen Ashford had narrowly escaped death, saved by the timely antidote administered by the doctor. But the question remained, who had tried to kill her, and why? Poirot knew that the answers lay somewhere within the web of lies spun by the guests themselves. There was something more to this than mere coincidence. As the evening wore on, he found himself becoming increasingly convinced that the true motive was one of revenge. A revenge that had been simmering for years, perhaps even decades. But revenge for what? What was it that tied these people together, and what did the sous chef's murder, along with the attempt on Ashford's life, have to do with it? The confrontation Poirot had kept a careful eye on the guests, ever since the second attempt on Gwendolyn's life. He had seen the subtle shifts in their behavior, the nervous glances exchanged when they thought no one was looking. But tonight it was time to bring it all together. Poirot had no more time to waste. The guests had been instructed to meet in the dining room, the table now cleared of the remains of the meal. The air was heavy with tension as the last few were seated, their expressions a mixture of fear and confusion. Poirot stood at the head of the table, his back straight and his eyes scanning the group. They were all here. The Countess, Sir Alexander, Gwendolen Ashford, Charles Underwood, Eliza Thornton, Lady Beatrice, and the head waiter, who still had that faint look of guilt in his eyes. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice steady and sure, "we've arrived at the final stage of this evening's game. The first attempt on Madame Ashford's life was not an accident, nor was it a random act, nor, I believe, was the death of the sous chef. Everything here tonight, every piece of this puzzle, has been carefully orchestrated, but who is behind this? Who among you holds the key?" There was a brief silence before Sir Alexander Ffoulkes leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "Poirot, you've gone too far this time. You can't possibly expect us to believe that one of us here is responsible for—" "Not one of you," Poirot interrupted, "but several." He paused for a moment, allowing his words to settle. He saw the expressions shift, confusion and fear creeping into the eyes of the guests. Lady Beatrice clenched her hands together in her lap, while Charles Underwood's face turned a darker shade of red. Gwendolen Ashford's eyes were wide, and though she was still weak, she held herself with a certain dignity. Eliza Thornton, the writer, seemed the most composed, her sharp eyes never leaving Poirot. "Tell me, Madame Ashford," Poirot said, turning toward her. "Before the wine was served to you, you mentioned that you had been followed for days. Could it be that someone here has been waiting for the right moment to strike?" Gwendolen swallowed hard, her voice faint but strong. "Yes, I noticed someone watching me. But I thought it was my imagination or the stress of the evening. I didn't think anything of it, but now—" She trailed off, looking at the others with suspicion. "I see now. It wasn't just an accident. I was meant to be the target." Poirot nodded gravely. "Correct, madame. But who was the intended victim? The business tycoon, Charles Underwood, the retired judge, Sir Alexander Ffoulkes, or perhaps someone with a far more personal vendetta?" Charles Underwood stiffened, his face reddening. "What is this, Poirot? Accusations without proof. I've done nothing to deserve this kind of treatment." Poirot raised a hand, signaling for him to remain silent. "I know you believe you have nothing to hide, Monsieur Underwood. But you, of all people, have the most to gain from these deaths." The businessman opened his mouth to protest, but Poirot was already moving on. "Lady Beatrice, Madame Thornton, both of you have been quietly observing the entire evening, haven't you? But what if you both knew something you weren't willing to admit?" Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed, and she opened her mouth to speak, but Poirot continued before she could utter a word. "And the head waiter," he added, his gaze falling on the nervous man near the back. "You, monsieur, have been acting too nervous for my liking. You've been far too eager to cover your tracks. You've been involved in this from the beginning, haven't you?" The web unraveled. Poirot took a step back and surveyed the room. His mind was piecing together the scattered clues, the patterns that had formed over the course of the evening. The poison used in the wine was a rare toxin, one that only a select few could obtain, Poirot continued. The glass used by Gwendolen Ashford had traces of it, and the poison was carefully introduced into her glass, as if the murderer knew she would drink it. But the real clue, mes amis, is not in the wine itself, but in the wine's delivery. He turned sharply to face the head waiter. You brought the wine, did you not? The wine that was meant for the guests. But you were not the only one with access to it, were you? The head waiter's face paled, his hand trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. I didn't mean to. Poirot's eyes glinted with understanding. You didn't mean to what, monsieur? You didn't mean for the guests to drink the poisoned wine? Or perhaps you didn't mean for one of them to survive. He turned towards Sir Alexander Ffoulkes. And you, Monsieur Ffoulkes, a man of the law, surely you must know that justice is not served with poison. You and the Countess have a history together, one that is far more connected than you'd care to admit. The Countess stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is madness, Poirot. I told you I had nothing to do with it. But Poirot raised a hand to silence her, his voice steady and unwavering. It is not madness, madame. It is the truth. You were involved in a scheme, weren't you? A scheme to take back what you had lost, the wealth, the power, the control. And you used the others, each one of them, as pawns in your game. The Countess's eyes flickered, her composure crumbling for the first time that evening. I didn't, Poirot cut her off. But you did, madame. You and your accomplices. You planned everything down to the last detail. The poisoning of the sous chef, the attempt on Madame Ashford's life, all of it. And now, the truth is finally out. The reveal. Poirot took a deep breath and allowed the silence to settle in the room before delivering his final revelation. The accomplices were Sir Alexander Ffoulkes and Charles Underwood, Poirot declared, his voice ringing with finality. They were all part of a larger conspiracy, a conspiracy involving financial ruin, betrayal, and revenge. The Countess, once married to the late Duke, had lost everything, and in her desperation she turned to the others. Underwood had debts he couldn't repay, and Ffoulkes had always been seeking redemption. Poirot paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. And the final piece, the head waiter, was the one who delivered the poison, but only under duress, knowing full well that he would be next if he failed. But in the end, it was the Countess who orchestrated it all. She was the mastermind. The room fell into a stunned silence as Poirot's words took hold. One by one, the guests' faces drained of color as the realization dawned on them. They had all been involved, whether through coercion, greed, or naivety. But it was the Countess who had led them all down this dark path. Poirot stood, his back straight and his gaze unwavering. The game is over, mes amis. The truth has been revealed. And now, justice will be served. And with that, Poirot knew the night's twisted web of lies had finally unraveled. Chapter 10. The twist. The guests were motionless, their expressions frozen in shock as Poirot's final words hung in the air. The Countess, the mastermind behind the evening's deadly plot, stood at the far end of the room, her face a mask of cold fury, her hands trembling ever so slightly. Sir Alexander Ffoulkes and Charles Underwood had not spoken since Poirot's revelation, their faces drained of color. They knew, as Poirot had so aptly put it, that the game was up. For a moment, the silence stretched out, suffocating the room. It was as if no one dared to breathe, too stunned by the truth that had been laid bare. Poirot, however, was not done. He was merely giving them a chance to absorb the enormity of what had just transpired. With deliberate precision, Poirot walked towards the Countess. She looked up at him, her eyes fierce. But there was something else beneath the defiance. a flicker of fear or perhaps resignation. For the first time since the dinner had begun, her perfectly composed exterior was starting to crack. "You see, Madame," Poirot began, his voice smooth, almost gentle. "You believed you could control everything. You thought you could manipulate those around you, play them like chess pieces in a game where you were the queen, but in the end, it was the lies that bound you. And the truth, as it always does, has a way of surfacing." The Countess clenched her jaw, her fingers curling into fists. She refused to back down, though the tension in her body betrayed her growing panic. "I did what I had to do," she spat, her voice venomous. "I had nothing left." "You think you know everything, Poirot, but you don't?" "I know enough," Poirot said calmly. "Enough to know that this wasn't just about money or even revenge. This was about a past you couldn't outrun, Madame. You sought control, but control is fleeting. It always is." The Countess inhaled sharply, her lips curling into a twisted smile. "You think I did all of this because of a lost fortune? Because of some pathetic debts from my late husband? No, Poirot, you're wrong." It wasn't just that her eyes flickered toward the other guests, and Poirot noticed a tremor in her voice as she spoke the next words. "I did it because I wanted to destroy them. I wanted them to feel the same anguish I had. I wanted them to understand the cost of their greed." There was a chilling, almost manic edge to her words now. Underwood, Fawkes. They thought they could take from me. They thought I would let them escape their past mistakes, their betrayals. But I had no intention of letting them walk away scot-free. No one does. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. He had suspected as much. The Countess had not been motivated by mere money. No, her motives were far more personal, far more sinister. It was a web of betrayal, secrets, and twisted revenge that had been set into motion long before they had all gathered at Claridge's. A twist in the tale. But just as Poirot was about to speak again, a loud, unexpected noise interrupted him, a sharp clink of glass against the floor. Gwendolen Ashford, the pianist, who had been quietly watching the exchange, suddenly let out a strained gasp and slumped forward in her chair, her face paling once again. "Madame Ashford!" Eliza Thornton cried, rushing to her side. But Poirot was already on the move. His instincts kicked in, and he was beside her in an instant. Poirot gently grasped her wrist, checking for a pulse. Her breathing was shallow and her lips were tinged blue. It was as if the poison had returned with a vengeance. The room erupted into chaos as the guests scrambled to help. But Poirot held up a hand, his eyes cold as he assessed the situation. "This is no accident," he said, his voice sharp. "It's happening again. Whoever is behind this, whoever thought they had killed her once, tried to finish what they had started." The Countess' face drained of all color as she stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. No, I didn't." Poirot held up a finger, silencing her. "You had already killed the sous-chef. And now you attempted to finish the job on Madame Ashford. But something went wrong, did it not, Madame? Tell me, who else has been involved in this little game of yours?" The Countess' eyes flickered towards Sir Alexander and Underwood, who both appeared just as stunned as everyone else. She seemed to understand that the final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but she was reluctant to reveal everything. Poirot's eyes hardened. "No more lies, Madame. You will tell me everything." Now for a moment the Countess hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke again, her voice quieter, almost resigned. "It wasn't just me. I had help. I needed help." Poirot tilted his head, urging her to continue. And who helped you? The Countess looked toward Sir Alexander Folks, the man who had been quietly observing the chaos unfold, his face pale. He did, she whispered, nodding toward him. The room fell into an eerie silence as everyone turned towards Sir Alexander, their faces now filled with confusion and suspicion. The judge stood frozen for a moment before he slowly straightened his back, his jaw clenching. I had nothing to do with this, Sir Alexander said firmly, though his voice lacked conviction. I have no idea what she's talking about. But Poirot, ever the observant detective, wasn't fooled. It was you, Sir Alexander. You had a connection with the Countess, a shared history. You were willing to help her for the right price. You wanted revenge on the very people who had taken from you, just as the Countess wanted to destroy them. But this wasn't just about money. No, it was about the deep-seated hatred you all shared. Poirot turned toward the others. And so, together, you all conspired. The poison was delivered, the blame placed elsewhere, and all of you thought you would walk away from it unscathed. But Poirot's voice hardened again as he stepped closer. You were wrong. The shocking twist. Poirot's eyes scanned the room once again, his gaze moving over each face as he revealed the final truth. It was not Sir Alexander who made the final move, he said. No, the true mastermind was someone far closer than you realized. The room fell into complete silence as Poirot's words sank in. The real killer, the one who wanted all of this to end, was not the Countess or Sir Alexander or even Charles Underwood, Poirot continued. It was you, Eliza Thornton. The room gasped in shock as all eyes turned to the writer. Eliza Thornton, the sharp-eyed observer who had watched so carefully, her words calculated, her demeanor the calm center of the storm, had masterminded the entire scheme. What? Sir Alexander whispered, his face slack with disbelief. Don't be surprised, Poirot said, his voice chillingly calm. Miss Thornton, the famed author of suspense and mystery, had the perfect understanding of how to manipulate this game. She knew how to plant the seeds of doubt, how to twist everyone's emotions, how to turn the truth into fiction. You were all her pawns in a deadly plot for revenge. Not just for the Countess, but for herself. She had everything to gain from the deaths of these people. Eliza's face remained eerily composed as she stood, not a hint of fear in her eyes. You're clever, Poirot. You always have been, but you were too focused on the obvious clues, the loud ones, to see what was right in front of you. Poirot's gaze softened just slightly, though the truth was already in his grasp. Ah, but the subtlety of a writer, madame, is often their downfall. You wove your web of lies too well. And now, the truth is exposed. The aftermath with Eliza Thornton's confession, the night of dread was finally over. The poison that had nearly claimed Gwendolyn Ashford's life was traced back to her, as well as to the death of the sous chef. The guests were left stunned and horrified, unable to grasp the depths of the betrayal that had unfolded under their noses. Poirot, with his usual composure, quietly looked over the room one last time. The pieces had fallen into place, and the deadly game of lies was finally over. Justice, Poirot said softly, is always served. Even when it is buried beneath layers of deception, the silence in the room was absolute, and with that, the mystery was solved.